A team of archaeologists at the University of Oregon have found one of North America's oldest human-occupied sites in southern Oregon.
Archaeologists pulled something out of the dirt that should not exist. They sent it to the lab once. The number came back wrong, so they tested it again with a different sample on a different machine. The results came back once, twice, 3 times, and every single test pointed to the same impossible conclusion. Whoever left this behind was standing on American soil thousands of years before history says any human being was here. And what they uncover next does not just rewrite the history books, it destroys them. For most of the 20th century, scientists believed the story was settled. The first humans in America were the Clovis people, ancient hunters who crossed a frozen land bridge from Asia around 13,000 years ago and spread across the continent. Simple, clean, accepted. That version of history appeared in textbooks, documentaries, museums, and classrooms across the world. But deep inside a row of dry caves in south-central Oregon, archaeologists found something no one was prepared for. Not a weapon, not a tool, not treasure. Something far stranger. Preserved human remains, left untouched for thousands of years beneath the cave floor, and hidden inside them was something stone tools could never provide: human DNA. What scientists discovered in those caves would challenge everything we thought we knew about the first Americans. And once the dating results came back, there was no turning back. If you enjoy mysteries, lost history, and discoveries that change everything we know about the past, make sure to subscribe, because this story only gets more unbelievable from here. The dry desert climate had accomplished something almost impossible. It preserved a delicate organic trace across tens of thousands of years, and hidden inside those ordinary-looking remains was something stone tools could never provide: human DNA. When researchers extracted and analyzed the mitochondrial DNA, the outcome was impossible to ignore. The genetic signatures matched Native American founding haplogroups A2 and B2. These were not traces from some mysterious vanished civilization or an ancient migration that disappeared without descendants. These were the direct ancestors of indigenous peoples living in the Americas today. Real families, real bloodlines, connections stretching backward through thousands of years to a cave most people had never even heard of. Then came the dating results. Scientists used accelerator mass spectrometry, a highly precise method capable of determining the age of organic material itself rather than relying on surrounding soil or artifacts. Once the results were calibrated, the remains were dated to more than 14,000 years ago, over 1,000 years earlier than the accepted arrival of the Clovis people. That changed everything. The Clovis culture was not the first human presence in America. In fact, they were nowhere near as early as researchers once believed. But here's what makes the story even more unsettling. Paisley Caves was not the first site to challenge the old timeline. It was simply the discovery that forced the scientific community to finally pay attention. Years earlier, another crack had already appeared far away in western Pennsylvania at a place called Meadowcroft Rock Shelter. The site sat beside a quiet stream not far from the Ohio River, protected beneath large sandstone overhangs that formed a natural shelter. One archaeologist later described it as the perfect prehistoric resting place, the kind of location ancient travelers would naturally stop at without a second thought. Back in 1955, local historian Albert Miller reached into a groundhog burrow on the property and pulled out several strange artifacts from the dirt. Those objects should not have been there. Then, in 1973, archaeologist Jim Adovasio began a full excavation of the shelter. Layer by layer, he dug deeper into the earth. And the deeper he went, the older the evidence became. When the radiocarbon dates finally returned, the implications were explosive. Humans may have occupied Meadowcroft between 16,000 and 19,000 years ago. In 1980, Adovasio published the findings and directly challenged the long-standing Clovis first theory. The response from many scientists was immediate and harsh. Some argued the samples must have been contaminated. Others simply dismissed the evidence altogether. Over time, archaeologists even coined a phrase for this resistance: Clovis primacy syndrome. Critics described the continued defense of the old theory as outdated and increasingly impossible to justify. Even today, the debate has never fully disappeared. Surveys of archaeologists show that many researchers still disagree about the Meadowcroft dates, while others remain uncertain. So by the time Paisley Caves entered the conversation, the foundation of the old story was already beginning to crack. Paisley simply shattered it. And not far from Paisley, another discovery was already waiting to push the timeline back even further. Around 70 miles away, near the tiny town of Riley, Oregon, sits Rimrock Draw Rock Shelter. Since 2011, University of Oregon archaeologist Dr. Patrick O'Grady and his team have been excavating the site. Unlike Paisley, Rimrock Draw was not preserving DNA. Instead, it was preserving stone tools, extinct animal remains, and a timeline buried inside layers of volcanic ash. The most important clue was a band of white ash embedded in the ground. Scientists identified it as ash from a specific eruption of Mount St. Helens, dated to roughly 15,400 to 15,600 years ago. That ash acted like a timestamp written into the earth itself. Anything buried beneath it had to be older, and what researchers discovered below that layer should not have existed. The team recovered 27 tiny tooth fragments from the soil. One belonged to an ancient camel species that once roamed Ice Age North America. Another came from Bison antiquus, a massive ancestor of the modern American bison. Both animals had vanished thousands of years ago, yet their remains were sitting beneath the ash layer together. Then researchers uncovered something even more remarkable: a stone tool crafted from orange chalcedony. The artifact had multiple working surfaces: a sharp cutting edge, a scraping edge, and a serrated side, polished smooth from years of repeated use. Patrick O'Grady later compared it to a prehistoric Swiss Army knife. This was not a tool someone used briefly and discarded. Whoever owned it had carried it for years, sharpening and reshaping it again and again, until one day it was left behind forever. Its location stunned the researchers. The tool rested nearly 10 centimeters below the camel tooth fragments, meaning it was even older than the animal remains above it. Then the dating results arrived. The lab tested the samples once, then tested them again. Both analyses pointed to the same astonishing time frame, roughly 21,000 to 22,000 years ago. O'Grady later admitted how terrifying that result felt. A date that old could overturn decades of accepted history, and announcing something so controversial without strong evidence would be risky. But now, there were two independent tests giving the same answer. The extinct animals at Rimrock Draw were more than 18,000 years old, and the stone tool buried beneath them hinted that humans may have been there even earlier. Suddenly, the accepted story of the first Americans no longer looked secure at all, and these tools belonged to what archaeologists call the Western-stemmed tradition, a completely different technology from the famous Clovis points most people know today. These tools looked nothing like the famous Clovis points archaeologists had built their timeline around. Their blades were longer, the shoulders weaker, and the bases rounded instead of fluted. They came from a completely different tool-making tradition, shaped by different people with different techniques. And most importantly, they were far older than Clovis. Whoever created them was not part of the culture historians once believed were the first Americans. They were something else. But Oregon was only the start. Roughly 700 miles to the south, hidden in a vast desert of white gypsum where almost nobody had bothered to search carefully, another discovery was waiting beneath the ground. 61 footprints. And according to the accepted timeline, the people who made them should never have been there at all. The ghost tracks of White Sands. At White Sands National Park in southern New Mexico, researchers exploring the dried beds of ancient Ice Age lakes began noticing strange impressions pressed into the pale gypsum surface. Human footprints, not a few scattered tracks, but dozens of them. 61 fossilized footprints left behind by people walking along the shoreline of an ancient body of water known as Lake Otero. The prints were astonishingly detailed. Some still showed individual toes and the curves of human arches. A few belonged to small children. Others appeared to be adults moving quickly across the wet ground, almost as if they were hurrying. These were not isolated tracks from a single traveler. They were the traces of entire groups of people crossing a landscape that vanished thousands of years ago. A single moment, frozen in mud, baked dry under the sun, buried beneath layers of sediment, and rediscovered ages later. Then came the dating. In 2021, scientists tested seeds from spiral ditch grass found within the same sediment layers as the footprints. Radiocarbon analysis produced a shocking age estimate, between 21,000 and 23,000 years old. That immediately triggered controversy. Critics argued that groundwater could have contaminated the seeds with ancient carbon, artificially making them appear much older than they really were. It was a fair concern. So the researchers tested the site again, using an entirely different source. This time they analyzed ancient conifer pollen buried in the same layers. Unlike the seeds, pollen is not affected by groundwater carbon contamination because it comes directly from living trees growing at that time. The results came back, and they matched almost perfectly. Again, the age range landed between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago. Then came a third study. In June 2025, researchers published new findings based on organic material extracted from wetland mud and shallow lake sediments at the site. 3 independent dating methods, 3 different materials, 3 separate analyses, and every one of them pointed to the exact same conclusion. Humans were walking across White Sands during the peak of the last ice age, when huge portions of North America were still locked beneath brutal frozen conditions. What made the discovery even more surreal was what surrounded the human tracks. The footprints appeared alongside tracks from Columbian mammoths and giant ground sloths, enormous Ice Age animals that disappeared thousands of years ago. Their paths crossed the same muddy ground as humans, preserved together in the same ancient layer of earth. For many archaeologists, that discovery alone was already difficult enough to accept. But White Sands may not even be the oldest evidence, because deep in Southern California, another site was uncovered accidentally, and its age is so extreme that it makes White Sands seem almost recent. It started during an ordinary freeway construction project. Workers cutting through the soil suddenly struck bone. The machinery stopped immediately. At first, the crew assumed it was a buried rock or some kind of pipe. But when the foreman looked closer, he realized the curved object emerging from the dirt was something entirely different, something alive once. Construction halted, and paleontologists were called to the scene. As excavations began, researchers uncovered the partial skeleton of a mastodon, a massive elephant-like animal that vanished near the end of the Ice Age. But something about the bones felt wrong. They were not lying naturally in the sediment. The deeper the team dug, the clearer the pattern became. This was not simply a fossil deposit. It looked like a scene frozen in time. Several of the mastodon bones showed spiral fractures, a type of break that occurs only when bone is still fresh and flexible. Ancient fossilized bones normally shatter apart. Fresh bones twist and crack in spirals when struck with force. Someone had intentionally broken these bones, most likely to extract the nutrient-rich marrow hidden inside. Then researchers noticed something else. Large, rounded cobblestones scattered among the remains. 5 heavy rocks that did not naturally belong in the surrounding soil. Geologists examined the site carefully and concluded the stones were too large to have been transported there naturally by flowing water. Someone had carried them there, and according to the researchers, they were likely used as hammer stones and anvils before being abandoned beside the mastodon remains. That alone would have been extraordinary. But then the dating results arrived. Scientists used uranium-thorium dating on the mastodon bones. Every test pointed to the same impossible number, around 130,700 years old. That date was so extreme it stunned the archaeological world. In 2017, the findings were published in the journal Nature by researchers Stephen Holan, Kathleen Holan, Thomas Demarais, and Richard Fullegar. And although the wording in the paper was cautious and highly technical, the implication exploded through the scientific community like a bombshell. The implications tore straight through archaeology. If the Ceruti site is genuine, then some kind of human species was already living in North America around 130,700 years ago. Not modern humans, not Neanderthals. Something older, something we may not even fully understand yet. And that is exactly why the site remains so controversial. Most mainstream archaeologists have kept their distance from Ceruti. The discovery is simply too disruptive. Accepting it would mean admitting that some of the most important models about human migration may be incomplete or completely wrong. So, the biggest question still hangs there, unanswered. Who stood beside that mastodon in ancient California? Who smashed those bones apart for marrow and left the stone hammer tools behind? The truth is, nobody knows, and the deeper researchers dig, the stranger the answers become. For decades, the accepted story was simple. Humans entered the Americas through a single route, the Bering Land Bridge connecting Siberia to Alaska during the Ice Age. One path in, one migration, one origin story. But new evidence from genetics and archaeology is beginning to point somewhere entirely different. Not across frozen land, across open ocean. A growing number of researchers are now exploring an idea once considered impossible. What if some of the earliest people reached the Americas by boat? And what if their journey began not in Siberia, but along the coast of ancient China? At first, that sounds absurd. But then archaeologists uncovered evidence in a place that changed everything, the island of Crete. Today, Crete sits isolated in the Mediterranean Sea. And here's the important part. It has been separated from the mainland for nearly 5 million years. At no point during human existence was it connected by land, which means any ancient humans who reached Crete had only one option. They crossed open water, not accidentally drifting on debris, not floating randomly with the current. They had to build watercraft capable of traveling dozens of miles through the sea intentionally. Researchers Thomas Strasser and Eleni Panagopoulou uncovered ancient stone tools at 2 sites on Crete. But these were not recent artifacts. The tools dated somewhere between 130,000 and 700,000 years old, and they resembled tools associated with Homo erectus and Homo heidelbergensis, ancient human ancestors that lived long before modern humans appeared. That discovery changed the conversation completely. Because if early humans were already capable of building boats and navigating open water hundreds of thousands of years ago, then one of archaeology's oldest assumptions suddenly collapsed. The idea that ancient humans were incapable of major sea travel no longer made sense. One member of the research team said, "The discovery forced scientists to reconsider nearly everything they thought they knew about early migration." And then genetics entered the picture. That is where the story becomes even more unsettling. Researchers examining a mitochondrial DNA lineage known as D4H traced part of its ancestry back to northern coastal China. But the genetic evidence did not point toward one single migration into the Americas. Instead, it suggested 2 separate waves arriving during completely different periods. The first migration may have happened around 26,000 years ago. These people likely traveled gradually along the Pacific coastline by boat, moving from coastal China through Japan, and eventually along the edge of the Americas. They were not marching across an inland ice corridor. They were surviving along the sea, fishing, following migrating animals, stopping at temporary camps wherever the coastline provided enough food to continue the journey. The migration may have taken centuries, possibly even generations, but according to this theory, it worked. Then came a second migration wave, roughly 15,000 years ago. This group likely crossed through Beringia by land and became associated with later populations connected to the Clovis culture. For years, archaeologists believed these people were the first Americans. Now it appears they may have arrived long after others had already reached the continent. And here's where the evidence starts becoming difficult to ignore. Who was breaking apart mastodon bones in California over 130,000 years ago? Drop your theory in the comments below. And if this story changed the way you see history, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and check out the next documentary on your screen, because the next major discovery could happen at any moment. And when it does, we'll be here to break it down with you first.